a scientist who devotes his time to his craft, sails to a tropical island with his friend and wife. Unlike his previous visits, the people display such grimness toward them. The visitors insist on staying, uncovering the horrifying mystery and the locals' unique way in handling the issue. Captain McBee criticizes Dr. Paul Henderson, a scientist who regularly visits a tropical island once every 6 months. Carla Henderson, Paul's wife, agrees with the captain, adding that she thinks it's her husband's act of atonement. Therefore, McBee jokingly tells her to grab this chance to desert her husband, and upon seeing a handsome ship crew, she meaningfully says she's considering it. Jim Farrell, Paul's friend and a foreman, warns the captain that Carla may cause trouble with his crew. Then, the friends dismiss themselves. Soon after, the ship crew pushes Mrs. Henderson into a room. She firmly rejects his advances, but in the end, she gives in. When the ship nears the dock, Carla comments on how the locals seem strangely sad and scared. Then, they get off the boat and stop on their track upon seeing an arriving group of natives. The visitors approach them to greet them, but the hostile faces of the people make it awkward. On the other hand, Jim becomes pleased to see a line of beautiful ladies for whatever ceremony they're holding. As they watch the local procession, one of the men, carrying something wrapped in traditional mats, loses balance, exposing a woman's decapitated head and leg. A fellow villager returns the body parts to the bundle as Carla screams in terror. Then, the locals throw the bodies into the ocean while the chieftain, Arcadio, offers a prayer. After the funeral, the visitors are escorted to the main village, and Carla inquires about the reason for the women's demise. Arcadio tells them it's an accident and introduces them to her granddaughter, Alum, adding that she has studied on the mainland so she can speak English. He also mentions that they're the only two on the island who can speak the foreign language, but Alum politely corrects her grandfather by saying other people like Mr. Powers and Goro also know how to. As an act of politeness, Alum says that they'd help them in any way, but Carla interjects, saying that she better focus on Jim in the pleasure department since her husband won't be of any use. Alum becomes surprised by the sudden comment, so Paul warns his wife and reminds her of what she's done. Jim asks the locals to help bring their equipment inside the house to break the ice. Once they start unpacking, Arcadio honestly tells Paul that despite the mainland's request to provide them shelter, things have changed since last year. They've returned to their ancient ways, so it'd be better to leave the island since the ship is still by the dock. He leaves without further explanations, so Paul inquires about it, but Alum repeats what the chieftain said and adds they're not proud of what they're doing. The next day, Jim leads the locals in building some basic infrastructures to help the island prosper and make the people's lives more convenient. Then, he notices a strange dead tree and asks about it. An older villager warns Alum not to tell about the tree, so she leaves in a hurry. Meanwhile, Carla looks for her husband and finds him collecting moss specimens. Paul asks about the time, and his wife tells him it's just 4:30 in the afternoon, but the sun sets quite early. She adds that the island is very peaceful and notices her husband staring at her. Carla tells her husband that she isn't one of his specimens. However, Paul thinks it would be a lot simpler if she was. After a moment of silence, Carla decides that they should leave before it gets dark, so Paul follows. Carla stops walking upon seeing a strange crab that looks like stone. Frightened, the wife urges them to return home, and Paul bags the discovery. When they arrive at the seaside, Carla comments about the stillness of everything during sunset, but Paul ignores her concerns. Then, they witness another ritual headed by Arcadio, where all the young women draw a pebble from a pot. Alum takes a white stone and smiles in relief, but the lady after her takes a black one, making the chieftain more anxious before leaving while the woman sobs in agony. The visitors become confused and head home as the locals act more strangely. Suddenly, a steward named Goro intercepts and welcomes them to Blood Island. Then, he explains that his master, Esteban Powers, invites them for dinner. While Goro escorts them, he apologizes for the inconvenience of their path, but as they go deeper into the island, they hear a screech and see a strange moving plant. Goro ushers them to hurry, finally arriving at a century-old mansion. The steward brings them to his master, and they see a man passionately playing the piano. Mr. Esteban Powers exchanges pleasantries with them and asks them to stay in their mansion. Jim declines due to the nature of his job, but Carla decides for her and Paul and accepts the offer. Over dinner, Mr. Powers asks the doctor about his real purpose in coming to the island. Paul explains that he's there to check the island's ecosystem, especially as it was on a range of an atomic bombing in the late 40s. He expects not to find any effect but discovers a mutated crab earlier. Their conversation halts when the host drinks migraine medicine. Afterward, Mr. Powers probes about the mutation of other creatures and how long it will take the doctor to discover the changes. Paul admits that the time frame depends on various factors, so he can't say for sure. Jim asks if this can also happen to humans, which catches the host's attention, and the doctor concludes that it's theoretically possible. The following day, Goro escorts the visitors back to the village, and they see more mutated plants. A branch suddenly attacks Carla, so Jim hurriedly cuts it off, and they hurry to get out of the forest. Then, they come across another local ritual where the two women who drew the black stones are carried to a place that looks like an open ritual area. The women are petrified in bamboo poles and adorned with flowers. Then, the chieftain takes off the lady's upper garment before instructing their visitors to return home since there's nothing they can do to help. Late that night, Arcadia watches the surroundings from their house when the loud roaring sounds of an unknown animal echoes. Then, a mutated butterfly enters, which Paul tries to capture, but the insect bites him and flies away. While Jim attends to his injuries, Carla asks what's happening, so the doctor explains that an unknown creature is undergoing severe mutation. Meanwhile, a monster-like creature arrives at the ritual grounds and attacks the offerings. Upon hearing their shrieks, Jim tries to help, but Arcadio threatens him with a knife so he won't mess up the ritual. Soon after, the noise stops, and when morning comes, another funeral is held. Jim watches it with Alam, who insists that this is wrong since everyone could be gone. Alam comments that the men will be safe since the monster only accepts women, since he satisfies himself with them, even if it tears the bodies apart. On the other hand, the local men help Paul and Carla with the visitors' bags. After the men leave, Carla expresses her concern about the monster on the island, but her husband assures her they will be safe. Later, Paul resumes collecting specimens with Carla. The wife confesses how anxious she's getting due to the terrifying events and grabs the chance to open up a talk of divorce which could be more beneficial for them. However, Paul brushes off all of her concerns and admits that he already gave up on Carla's condition a long time ago, so there's nothing to discuss between them. Despite his harshness, Carla also wishes that what Paul said is true and hopes she has no feelings left for him. Goro arrives to bring them his equipment, and they see that the plants have returned to normal. The steward remarks that the nighttime on the island creates deceit. At the same time, Jim and Alam focus on crop irrigation, and with such progress, the local men tease the woman that if things turn out well with Jim, she can even go to America. In the mansion, Paul and Carla converse with Mr. Powers about the attacks, and the host asks them if the doctor informs the captain about the events, and Paul confirms he does. The doctor probes Mr. Powers' opinion on the matter, concluding that it's a madman rather than a monster. Then, the host invites them to switch places to watch the best sunset, but the couple comments that the atmosphere remains gloomy, like a mortuary, especially after witnessing yesterday's events. That evening, the village turns chaotic when a mutated tree attacks the locals. When the locals subdue the tree, the offering selection commences. This time, Alam picks the black pebble. Jim tries to save her, but the warriors petrify him and lock him up. Jim persuades the guards to end this ritual and fight the monster instead, but the warriors become upset and threaten him to stop, so he does. While everyone is watching the ritual, Jim quietly unties himself by burning it on the oil lamp. Unfortunately, the guards notice him, and a brawl begins. Jim knocks them unconscious just in time for Arcadio to discover his escape. The chieftain tries to stop him, but he's subdued quickly. Then, he yells at Jim that he will endanger the village due to his reckless acts, but the younger man already rushes to help the women. Jim arrives at the ritual grounds too late as the other woman already perishes at the monster's hands. On the other hand, Alam loses consciousness upon seeing the horrible scene. Jim fires his flare gun near the monster, and it runs away. So he goes to Alam and covers her with his jacket before they flee the area. They return to the village, but no one lets them in. Upon changing clothes, Alam tells Jim that they better hide in the forest since their people believe that if the monster isn't sated, it'll attack the villagers. Jim fails to understand their logic, but the warriors already commenced their strike toward them. Therefore, they have no choice but to run to the forest. The warriors chase them, and one is about to throw a spear at them, but the head warrior who always teases the two halts the attack. Jim brings Alam to Mr. Powers' mansion despite the woman's anxiety about entering the place, but the man reassures her it's safe. Upon entering the house, Carla greets them, and when Jim asks where Esteban is, she explains that the man has been sick since last night due to a migraine. Consequently, Goro listens to them anxiously. Then, Paul excitedly invites the new guests to see the mutated cockroach he's been studying, but when they return to his room, it's just an ordinary insect. Jim concludes that it may have transformed to its original form, and Carla agrees with him since since she's seen a mutated banana tree that returned to normal the other day. Goro interrupts their conversation by ushering the new guests to their rooms, but the discussion remains on Carla's mind. That evening, Carla initiates an intimate moment with Paul, but the scientist is deeply asleep and has no response, so she sneaks into Esteban's room. When she's about to touch him, Goro frantically stops her and ushers her out. Esteban and the guests discuss the previous night's events the following day. Jim asks if they could use the villagers' small boats to escape the island, but Mr. Powers tells them it's too far. Carla probes about anyone who's seen the monster, and Alam answers that everyone who did pass away, soliciting Esteban's intense stare. She adds that she fainted before the beast came to her. After breakfast, Paul resumes collecting specimens, and Mr. Powers volunteers to accompany him despite Carla's efforts to convince him to stay in the house. Paul understands his wife's intentions, so he happily accepts Esteban's company. Unbeknownst to them, Goro is watching on the sidelines while Mr. Powers probes the doctor about his findings. The scientist questions why the locals aren't mutated, and Esteban says that the locals weren't on the island when the bomb exploded, adding that they were sent from resettlement centers after the explosions. That evening, they learn more about Esteban and his wife Beatrice. He mentions that things were very smooth until the war hit, which confuses Jim since that was about 30 years ago, making the host close to 50 in age. Paul asks about how Beatrice passed away, and the host narrates that she contracted an unknown disease that not even people on the mainland can cure. Her symptoms were only extreme skin darkening and high fever. Then, suddenly she felt overwhelming pain before ending her life. Paul inquires if the events happened during the bombing, and Esteban confirms it, saying they went boating for their anniversary without knowing they had entered the radiation area. He jokes that the only thing he may have gotten from the trip is his youth. Then, Goro interrupts him to take his medicine. Late that night, Mr. Powers hurries out of the house while Carla sneakily follows him. The stewards watch while the woman brews in anticipation of being with the host. Unfortunately, the mutated plants attack her, so she runs deeper into the forest, where she comes across the monster. Meanwhile, Paul discovers that Carla and Esteban are both gone. Due to the commotion, Alam arrives and hears the problem. They all venture into the forest to search for their companions, but the trees suddenly attack Alam. The men rescue her using their pistol and a blade. However, Jim realizes that the woman can't go with them further, so he persuades Paul to return to the mansion. He refuses to leave and calls Carla until Goro arrives, instructing them to return to the mansion. Paul suspects the man as the culprit for her wife's disappearance, especially after hearing him say it's too late for the lady, so he charges at him. They brawl with each other, and Goro uses the doctor's blade to end his life. Jim shoots Goro, and he runs for his life. Moments later, they hear rusting approaching them, but it's Esteban who arrives, full of wounds. Mr. Powers explains that he's had an epileptic attack and wakes up in the middle of the woods. He sees Paul's lifeless body, so he diverts the conversation asking what happened. Jim explains that Goro did it to Paul, and the master expresses his disappointment. They return home, and Esteban weakly trudges to his room. He hurries to drink his medicine, but the container falls. When he's about to take a pill, his hand changes into a monstrous one. He looks at it horrified, but Jim and Alam barge into his room, looking for the missing flare gun, which could help face Goro. Esteban manages to wrap his arms with a blanket and insists on pushing the guests out of his room. His complete transformation into a hideous monster occurs as soon as he's alone. Meanwhile, Jim and Alam go into the woods and hear the monster's roars from the house. Because of this, the man suggests they must find a path to the village. Unfortunately, the mutated tree branch wraps around Jim, and Alam bravely hits the branches with wood to free her companion. They escape the moving branches but see Carla's head hanging on a branch instead, causing them to feel terrified as they try to escape from the trees and the monster. Just then, Goro pounces on Jim, disarming him. Then, the steward bravely approaches the monster, calling it master and reassuring it that it will be safe now. However, the monster attacks him and ends his life. Jim and Alam head to the village and plead for the chieftain's help. The door finally opens, but they're greeted with spears and the angry Arcadio reprimanding his granddaughter for endangering the people's lives. Jim yells at him to criticize his cowardly way of sacrificing women instead of fighting. He persuades them again to fight the monster together, and he finally succeeds, so Jim devises a plan to end the creature. Moments later, when the monster arrives, the village men throw torches at it as it seems it was scared by the flare gun. They corner the monster, but it enters a hut where Alam is. Upon seeing a woman, the creature holds her tightly. The locals burn the house where the monster is, and knowing Alam is inside, Jim charges in. Fortunately, Alam can kick a wall and jumps out of the hut and away from the beast. Jim fights it off, but the creature pushes him out. Arcadio and the warriors help him get away from the burning hut, and raging flames finally surround the monster. Soon, the hut collapses and the roaring ends, revealing Esteban's lifeless body. After recovering from the horrific events, the village returns to normal. The ritual area becomes a gathering site to commemorate their success in fighting off a monster, as reflected in their dancing and songs. Seeing Jim enjoy the dance among the men and women, Alam steps into the stage and offers a dance to Jim. Afterward, they rush to where the local couples gather to share love and intimacy, and they finally have each other.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.